Okay, I think he's gonna turn it up a little. I'm a little quiet, I'll try to be loud. Well, I'm sure people are gonna continue to trickle in, but let's get started. It's great to be back again at the Cabin Show. I believe I am the final act of the weekend, and we'll all get home in time to make our Super Bowl food. So great to be here. My name is Carrie Renner. I'm an attorney and I own Provision Law Firm in Burnsville, Minnesota. I practice primarily in the area of estate planning and cabin succession planning. So that means I work a lot with the transfer of property. I also work a lot with relationships. And there is no better example of those things coming together than when we talk about the future of the family cabin. But before we get into that, I want to spend just a couple of minutes getting to know each other a little bit. I'll start with my story. I have been a licensed attorney for 24 years this year, but I have not been doing cabin planning the whole time. My passion for this practice area was born out of my own personal experience. It was about 10 years ago that my family and I started talking about the future of our cabin. And I thought, well, this should be easy. We've got this little tiny place up north. For the last 40 years, we've all managed to cram into it. And I thought, well, we'll talk about it, we'll put something in writing, and that'll be that. And it turns out it wasn't that easy, and we all didn't agree. Imagine families that don't agree, and that was us. But we came back and we talked about it more and more, and we continued to hear each other's perspectives, and ultimately we found something that works for us. And so I share with you that story to let you know that I do share a lot of your perspectives, a lot of your experiences. I am a second generation cabin owner, so I do understand the pitfalls. And I'm a mom. And I have to tell you that no cabin in the world matters more to me than those four continuing to get along and to have relationships with each other long after I'm gone. And I'm an attorney, and I have the privilege of hearing other people's cabin stories and helping them find solutions that work for them. So those are the hats I wear, and that's the perspective from which I talk today. So now you know a little bit about me. I want to hear a little bit about you guys too. So by a show of hands, how many of you have a cabin in your family that you go to on a regular basis, whether you own it or not? Okay, most of you. How many of you have had your cabin in the family for more than one generation? All right, and how many of you who have a cabin plan to pass it down to the next generation? Lots of you. All right, so you're in the right spot. 90% of people say that they want to give the cabin to the kids. The question is, how do they do it in the most seamless way possible? And how do they keep the relationships harmonious after they share the cabin together? Before I move on, I have to point out this family on the screen. These guys were clients of mine, and they gave me permission to share this photo. Those siblings were all in their 60s and 70s when we worked on their cabin plan. And they sent me this photo from them at the lake when they were kids. The cool thing is that none of them live in the state of Minnesota. Their cabin is here, and they have this awesome bond over their cabin in Minnesota, and they really wanted to preserve that for the future. So today we're going to talk about how to plan for the future of the cabin. And we're going to talk about 5 things that you should do when you're thinking about the future of the cabin. Number 1, have an honest conversation. Number 2, understand your legal rights. 3, define your rules. 4, make it legally binding. And 5, share your plan with the family. Number 1, have an honest conversation. Every good plan is going to start with open communication. Do not make assumptions. So if you own the cabin, it's really important that you talk to your kids. Do they want the cabin? You need to hear their perspective, because you might be thinking about the great monetary value that this cabin has, and all they can see are the maintenance costs that go into it. And you're remembering all of the fun that you had over the summers, and they're remembering a particular chaotic 4th of July weekend. And you think of it as relaxation, and they think of it as a chore. So it could be that cabin ownership is right for some of your children and not all of the children. It could be that they would rather take the money and rent a VRBO each year, and that's going to suit them better. In either case, you need to hear their thoughts. If your parents own a cabin and you would like that cabin someday, talk to your parents about it. What's their plan? Are they going to transfer that during their lifetime or at their death? Is that going to require probate? Are there other siblings that are going to need to be bought out of that ownership? So don't assume they have a plan in place. Talk to them and even help them get started on that plan. Number 2, understand what your legal rights are when you plan for the future of the cabin. So it's important to know how you hold title to your property, and that's going to tell you what your rights are for planning for that property. And you want to start by looking at the last deed that was recorded on that property. Is the property owned by an individual or some kind of a legal entity like a trust or an LLC? Does anybody have a life estate on the property that's going to limit your rights? And then look for the term joint tenants or tenants in common on the deed. What joint tenants means is that each owner owns an undivided 100% of the property. So when one person dies, the other continues to own the whole thing. Think of it as like a last man standing type of ownership. And that typically is the way that spouses will want to own property with each other. That may not be the way that siblings want to own property with each other. And if the term joint tenants does not appear explicitly on the deed, then in Minnesota, the default is that you own your property as tenants in common. So let's look at what that looks like in real life and look at some of the pitfalls of owning property as a tenant in common. Starting with, you could own your property with a stranger. So let's say that your brother Johnny decides, I'm going to sell my interest in the cabin to my friend. And now you own a cabin with Johnny's friend. Okay, so the reality is that probably isn't going to happen because Johnny's friend really doesn't want to own a cabin with you either. But what is more likely to happen is that Johnny may die and leave his interest in property to his spouse. And then his spouse may remarry and leave her interest to her new husband. And now you do own property with a stranger. Another pitfall of tenants in common is that it could end up in a partition action. So Johnny comes to you and he says, I don't want to own a cabin with you anymore, buy me out. And you said, I don't have any money. I'm not going to buy you out. I can't buy you out. And Johnny says, okay, well, then I'm going to file a court action called a partition. And you're going to have to buy me out. And in the process, there's going to be court costs and attorney's fees and many appraisers involved. And in the end, Johnny will be able to be bought out of his interest. That is his right. And lastly, probate. So unless Johnny plans otherwise and creates a plan to transfer his interest at death, his interest in the cabin is going to have to go through probate when he dies. Again, court and cost and time. And that's usually not the outcome that people are looking for. So really the moral of the story is, if you understand how you own the property, then you understand what your rights are to plan for the future of the property. All right, next up, you want to define your rules. So if the kids are going to share the cabin long term, you don't just want to transfer it to them and say, here you go. You want to transfer it to them and say, here you go, and here's a set of rules for that shared ownership. So let's look at what that would look like. Oh, before we do that, mom and dad. All right, when mom and dad own the cabin, really there are no rules. They pay for the gas in the boat, they mow the lawn, they keep all the condiments in the fridge, and the kids come up happy and go home tired. When there are no rules, we know how things can change. So I just wanted to share a quick story with you. I call it the whiskey story, but you'll see why in a minute. So a former client of mine, he had owned a cabin once upon a time with his brother, and it didn't work out, and he told me why. And he said it was Friday night, I had worked all week, I sat in traffic, I get to the cabin, and what do you know, my brother was there the last weekend and he didn't mow the grass. So the grass is this long. I go into the garage to get the lawnmower and there's no gas. So he says, all right, forget it, I'll do this later. And the kids want to go tubing, so he heads down to the lake, and there's no gas in the boat either. So now he's frustrated, and he says, I'm gonna make a drink. And he goes up to the fridge, and the whiskey's gone. And he says, that is it, I'm done. And the moral of the story here is that it doesn't have to be that way. If you've got a set of rules in place and expectations, it can go better than that. So let's start with, when making rules, the use of the cabin. Is the use of the cabin going to be determined by a lottery or an auction system? What about holiday weekends? Is that something that's open to everybody, or will that rotate through the families? And then how many guests can somebody bring up? When do weekends start and end? Define those things. What happens when the teenagers ask if they can go up unsupervised? I have teenagers at home, and I tell you the thing I hear more often than anything else is, it will be fine. So determine that in advance. Next, to define rules for paying the expenses of the property. You cabin owners know better than anybody that it is expensive to own a cabin. And there are all of the expected expenses. There's the utilities, the insurance, there are the property taxes. And then you've got the unexpected stuff that you weren't planning on. When a tree falls on the driveway, or there's mice in the cabin and you've got to call pest control. And then of course there's the fun stuff. I look around and I see a lot of it. And so you want to think about how those expenses are going to be paid. Is that going to be based on a percentage of ownership, a percentage of use, or some combination of those things? Decision making. When you're planning for the cabin, you're going to try to think of everything, but you won't. And so you need to put a system in place for decision making as things come up. So when Billy asks the group, can I store my 1973 Camaro next to the garage? You've got a decision maker. Sally wants to paint the kitchen cabinets. Joe's 3 Rottweilers like to sleep on the sofa. How do those things get decided before they bubble up and blow up? It could be that there's one person in charge. It could be a committee is in charge. It could be that you're differentiating between minor decisions and major decisions, like are we going to lease the property or sell the property? Hand in hand with decision making comes leadership. So you probably want somebody appointed to make the day-to-day decisions. Somebody to be the finance person who handles the banking and the taxes. There's a lot of work at the cabin. You need somebody to delegate that work. When does the lawn get mowed and by whom? And what about opening the cabin in the spring and closing it in the fall? Whose responsibility is that? And then think about whether these jobs are going to rotate around or they get elected on an annual basis, and whether or not people will be compensated for their time. This is a big one. Make it possible for those who want out to get out. So the kids say now we want to own the cabin. That may certainly change. It could be family dynamics. They go south. The financial commitment is more than they expected it to be. Could be they got sick of 94 and the traffic or the mosquitoes or any number of things. There are reasons that could be outside of a person's control. A divorce, a bankruptcy could force somebody out of a cabin ownership situation. So things will change. You need to plan that things will change. The flip side of that is, how do you make it affordable for those who want to stay to stay? It could be that when a family member is willing to buy out another family member, you build into that plan that there's a discount on that price, that they pay something less than fair market value in order to incentivize them to stay in that cabin ownership. It might be that the family has to buy a life insurance policy in order to support if a family member dies. How does that spouse get paid out so that he or she does not become an owner of the cabin? Or you may create a plan that says that's never going to happen. the spouses will never become owners of this cabin. But any of these things are going to require planning. They're not going to happen automatically. All right, this brings us to number 4, make your rules legally binding. So you've had the tough conversations, you've come up with the rules. Those rules aren't going to do any good if you don't make those rules legally binding. Because you know, as soon as it's not convenient for somebody to follow the rules anymore, they're not going to do it unless they're legally bound by those rules. So what happens if they don't have a legally binding contract in place is that it's going to end up in a lawsuit, and the property will probably be sold, and most likely the relationships are going to end after that. So what you want to do is look at a legal entity like a cabin trust or a cabin LLC. Generally speaking, a married couple who owns a cabin is going to opt for a cabin trust. And the reason for that is because they're doing their overall estate planning, looking at all of their assets and all of the transfer of assets at death, and they can tack on this sort of cabin planning at much less cost than if they were doing it as a standalone type of agreement. But that said, I can't emphasize enough what it says on the screen, which is a cabin in a trust is not the same thing as a cabin trust. So I hear people come to me with cabins and they've done some estate planning and they say, oh, we already put our cabin in the trust. And then I ask about all those things we just talked about, but what about a buyout? What about somebody not paying the expenses? What happens in those situations? And they said, well, I don't know, we didn't talk about that. Well, that's because they put the cabin in the trust, they retitled the cabin, it's in the name of the trust, and that's to avoid probate. That's to get it to the kids outside of probate when they die. And that's great, but that's only part of it. They have not set up the rules for shared ownership, and that's where the cabin trust comes into play. So cabin trusts work great in certain situations, and here's a few. They work great when the parents want to leave the cabin to the kids and let the kids decide at the time of death, do you want to opt into this shared ownership arrangement or do you want to opt out? Now it could be that there's enough money that the parents say, if you opt out, you can have this cash instead. Or it could be that there's not enough assets other than the cabin, but the parents are still willing to say, I'm offering you this shared ownership arrangement. If you don't want to take it, you can say no thank you, but there's not anything else instead. Sometimes parents want to leave seed money with the cabin. Now, this is to get the kids off their feet and get them used to paying those expenses until that becomes part of their budget. And if the parents want to ensure that that money is going to be spent on cabin expenses and the kids don't all agree to take a vacation with the money instead, then a trust is going to be a better way to ensure that. And then we talked earlier about spouses. If you want to ensure that a spouse is never going to come into ownership of that property or require a buyout, then a trust is the way to do that. So there are times when LLCs are a great idea. If you want a really flexible set of rules that can change with the kids and the generations, then that's a great option. LLCs can live forever, trusts can't. So if this is legacy property that you plan to live for many, many generations, you're going to want to be looking at an LLC. Also, if you've got rules in place that say, if you don't pay your fair share of expenses, then we're going to reallocate the ownership percentages. If your siblings had to pick up the tab for you for a year of expenses, then you no longer own 1/3. You own something less than that. And an LLC makes it very easy to do that. Okay, so we've come full circle now. This is the last step, step 5. You started by having a conversation with your kids to find out what they want, and you end this process by telling them about the plan that you made. You put a lot of time into laying out those rules, and you spent some money to make it legally binding. So this is the moment where you share that plan with your kids and make sure that everybody understands, everybody's on the same page. So I want to thank you guys. I know that everybody's probably thinking about the Super Bowl and ready to head out, but I appreciate you guys taking the time to be here. you love your cabins and you love your family, and you wouldn't be here if you didn't. We do have some free webinars coming up during the month of March, and there's information on those out back or just behind you on the chair. There's also a worksheet. So if you're in the process of talking to your kids about what would that look like to share the cabin, and you want some talking points, there's 50 things on the sheet back there, things that you will want to consider as you're talking about shared ownership. Thanks very much. I appreciate you coming out.